The first sentence I ever said aloud back on that broken stretch of road was, "I thought you were dead." It came out small, ridiculous, and wrong in a place that remembers things longer than people do. That line is the hook I should have run from, because whatever answered me from the shadow of the pig pen already knew my name. I came back for the sale of my father's tools, for the paperwork, for the last of the years piled into attic boxes. I told myself the trip was practical. I told myself it was closure. But as soon as the gravel gave way to familiar ruts and the farmhouse yawned into view, its porch sagging like an old jaw, the air hit me with the smell of damp hay and something sweeter, metallic, and wrong. It sat under everything else, like a second scent trailing behind the familiar barnyard. Blood, but not quite. Fermented, warm, like old meat left in the sun. The animals were out of place. Chickens clustered on the roof of the coop, feathers puffed and stirred by a wind that didn't move the leaves. The cow stared from the pasture with an unblinking patience that was almost human, chewing slow, like it was counting. But it was the pig I'd come back for. If I'm honest, the only reason I'd let myself drive those 3 hours. When I was a child, there was a pig named Amos that I talked to like a friend. He would follow me down the lane and nuzzle at my pockets. He had been my small, secret companion, and for weeks before my father died, I'd said I'd come home to see him once more. I found Amos in the doorway of the old feeding shed. He didn't move in the way pigs move. He sat in the doorway as if someone had propped him like a chair, forehead wet, ears alert like a listener. His eyes, my God, were too bright, too wet, reflecting the dim light like pits of oil. He looked at me with the sort of attention a person gives when someone speaks their name after a long absence. The sound he made was a low, wet click that matched the rhythm of my pulse. That night, the house remembered me with sounds stitched from memory. The loose step on the back stair, the pipe that moaned like a tired animal, the radio static that began at 11 and never quite stopped. I unloaded a bag and kept glancing at the shed as if Amos might vanish if I blinked. He did not vanish. Instead, small things started to tilt. At first they were banal. The troughs were full, though no one had fed them. The gates latched, though the latches had been broken for years. Then the noises began. A dragging behind the barn like something heavy being slid across concrete, a soft, breathy chorus at twilight, pigs squealing in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like breathing through a throat that was not wholly theirs. I told myself it was the house settling, or the wind, or that grief had sharpened every ordinary noise into accusation. But when I stepped outside to smoke and the moon cut the yard into hard silver, I found charred patches in the grass, small, round scars like someone had seared little mouths into the earth. And in the corner of the yard, where the feed was usually scattered and unremarked, there were tidy piles of something dark and glossy I did not have the vocabulary for. My stomach turned. I had the impossible, childish notion that Amos was waiting for me to notice, that he wanted something more than my company. The second week, there was no pretending. The farm stopped being merely crooked and started being precise in its cruelty. I began waking at odd hours, too alert to sleep, hearing the same soft, organized noise, a scraping that never found its source, and a high, wet chitter that tasted like copper when it reached my teeth. I tried to rationalize rats, seasonal change, my own frayed nerves, but reason felt thin against what I found. One morning, I followed a trail through the orchard, where the apples had fallen in neat concentric rings, as if something had taken a careful bite and left the rest arranged in judgment. The cows had been standing perfectly still since dawn, heads bowed, but when I walked by they raised them in unison and released a sound that was neither moo nor human, some middle tone that made the hair on my arms bristle. The chickens were gone. In their place, strings of feathers dangled from the branches like torn paper, and the air smelled of iron and fur. I went into the barn because the barn had always been where answers lived. The doors were shut, though I was certain I had left them ajar. Inside, the light leaked through slats and painted the floor in thin bars. The smell hit me first, Old hay, yes, and beneath it a thick animal sweetness of decayed meat. In the far corner, someone had dragged a tarp across the ground, and under it were shapes too familiar to my hands, parts of animals, trimmed and stacked, as if a butcher had been learning anatomy by night. The knives on the bench were clean and glinting. On the wall, someone had nailed photographs, kids from the town, faces I knew from my childhood, eyes scratched out and the edges of the paper darkened like burned flesh. When I stepped back, the floor felt alive, tiny movements underfoot, like insects or worms. I thought I was hallucinating until I heard the sound of something licking, patient, methodical, coming from the loft. I climbed the ladder and found rope and cloth and a small table set with a single bowl. The bowl had been washed and then refilled with something steaming. The steam smelled familiar, the same fermented iron that had haunted the yard. A low, wet sound echoed above me, and then the ladder creaked as if someone had rested a weight against it. That night, I slept with the radio on and lights blazing, but sleep did not come. At 3 a.m, the house filled with a chorus of soft, synchronized snorts. They began far away, then moved like a tide closer, until the walls themselves seemed to breathe. I left the safety of the house and stepped into the yard, teeth chattering in the cold, the moon white and ragged. Amos stood at the edge of the pig pen, but he was not alone. Dozens of pig-shaped silhouettes pooled like oil across the field, their forms rolling and shifting in ways that no living animal should. He walked toward me on 2 legs, then stopped and cocked his head the way he used to when I taught him tricks. But his mouth opened wider than a pig's should, revealing rows of teeth that were too many, too pointed. Around his snout, the skin had been pulled tight and threaded with faint red lines that glittered. He made that wet click again, my pulse answering like a drum. And I noticed then that the other silhouettes were moving toward the house, toward the lit windows, with a deliberate human patience. I ran. I shouldn't have, but every sensible bone in me urged flight. When I slammed my shoulder into the kitchen door, it did not close. Something heavy leaned on it from the inside and shook it as if testing the barrier. The sound of nails across wood came from the living room. Then a whispering laugh, a sound that could have been my father's voice twisted through a throat that wasn't his. I shoved by the table, and the light fell over something that made my vision blur. A chair in the center of the room, ropes coiled on it like a welcome mat. On the table, a plate sat with dark smears and a fork plunged into flesh I could not name. The front door banged open behind me. I felt something warm and wet on the back of my neck, and understood, with the simple clarity of a falling stone, that Amos had learned to use hands. They did not gag me immediately. There was a small, cruel courtesy to how they bound my wrists, cord wrapped again and again until the rope bit into my skin, knots practiced and tight. I remember the coarse scrape of fiber, the way the chair creaked when they settled me upright as if setting a prize on a mantel. The living room smelled like old cedar and something else I could not name at first, the sweet metallic heat that had haunted the yard, thick as gravy. Candles guttered on the table and threw the room into quicksilver, faces flickering, shadows stuttering. Amos sat across from me on a chair, fashioned too human for a pig. He tilted his head as if listening for a joke. Around him, the silhouettes that had gathered in the field pressed their faces to the windows, and the glass steamed with breath that was almost singing. He reached forward with his forelimbs like hands and arranged the plates with a ceremony I would have laughed at months before. On each plate lay a chunk of meat, so familiar that my stomach recoiled and then clenched. Muscle, sinew, the near visible pattern of someone's ribs. The table was an obscene mirror to my childhood suppers. Only the food wore an accusation I could not swallow. They fed me with deliberation. At first, it was tastes, a flake of something that burst copper across my tongue, a spoonful of blood-sweet broth that made my gums buzz. The sounds filled the room, the wet smack of teeth, the soft scrape of forks, the whispered names the crowd pooled like prayer. Someone, Amos? made that small clicking sound that had been my heartbeat since I arrived, and the light in his eyes was not animal. It was patient and greedy and strangely intimate. He leaned forward and spoke, the syllables porcine and human braided. "Do you remember how we used to share?" My father's laugh, the sound of my name from the radio, the low chorus from the barn, it braided into a single command. I tasted everything I had ever loved. The meat was not merely flesh, it was memory folded into protein. I thought I would puke, thought I would bite off my tongue, but my body betrayed me. My hands, tight with rope, trembling, took a fork. The first bite went down like surrender, like a key. There was a photograph tucked beneath my plate, edges singed. The face in it one I recognized and could not place until the candles trembled and my head cleared. My picture from a town picnic when I was 10. Someone had shaved the eyes out with exquisite care. I had eaten a portion of myself and did not yet know which piece. The room laughed in low, satisfied waves. That is when memory peeled open like a rotten fruit. The feed troughs, the neat rings of half-eaten apples, the chickens stripped and hung. The farm was not hungry in the old sense. It harvested attention. It learned to mimic affection, to fold itself into the hollow places left by loss. Amos had been trained by absence and hunger to be both butcher and priest. Each time I chewed, I felt something unlatching in the house, the ropes of whatever had been holding the barn's hunger in check giving way. The silhouettes at the window flattened their noses to the glass and sang, and their voices were like wind through bone. I tried to scream and found my voice swallowed, tasting of iron. I thought of running, of the road I had taken, and realized with a cold, clean clarity that leaving had always been a performance the farm allowed, until it had decided it needed an audience. The finality in the room settled like a lid. Amos leaned forward, wet breath on my cheek. And for a flicker, I saw the boy I used to be reflected in the oily black of his eyes. He did not look hungry then, he looked proud. They fed me until the candlelight thinned and my memory began to slide. I do not know exactly when the sounds became the house, when the house became them, or when my face stopped being my own. What I can say is this: the farm taught me how to listen, and then it taught me how to answer. I answered.
Subscribe to Horror Stories.